What a great turnout. I'm just so delighted to be here, to be able to join you this evening, to give a brief welcoming before I turn it over to Dr. Adams. My name is Paul Ortiz. I'm the director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program and a member of the faculty in the Department of History here. It was a great honor and privilege for me to be asked to give the welcome this evening for Dr. Steven Steinberg. And I just want to start, though, by thanking the Center for Humanities in the Public Sphere for organizing this event. And really, everyone on your way out should take a poster, please. Post it in your workplace, in your department. This is a wonderful series of events, discussions on the intersection of humanities, civil society, and social justice. Our colleagues Bonnie Efros, Sophia Cord, and Sean Adams deserve a big round of applause for making this kind of event possible. So please take publicity on your way out. The visit of Dr. Steven Steinberg to the University of Florida is a very important event in the history of our community. And Sean Adams is going to give a formal introduction of Steven in a moment. But as many of us know, Professor Steinberg has published very broadly in a wide array of scholarly journals and publications, including The Nation, New Politics. His work on racism and racial justice is marked by clarity, deep research, and common sense. And many of us, including myself, have come to rely on Steven as a person who asks the right questions about race and who does not shrink from drawing bold points based on rigorous analysis. Consider his dismantling of bad faith arguments against affirmative action, posed in his brilliant essay, The Role of Race in the Devolution of the Left. And this is an essay that I require my graduate students to read. It's the price of the ticket, okay? It's that good. Steinberg, in this essay, takes on arguments advanced in the 1980s, for those of us who were learning sociology during that time period, that race-based affirmative action should be replaced by class-based affirmative action in a society which, for heaven's sakes, is organized completely against the notion of class, right? In actuality, Steven says, quote, class-based affirmative action never had a chance of being enacted as policy, but served only as a red herring in the affirmative action debate. This explains why the idea of class-based affirmative action was embraced by the very conservatives who spearheaded the crusade against affirmative action. Clint Bolick, Dinesh D'Souza, Clarence Thomas, Charles Murray, Richard Herrenstein, Newt Gingrich, so on and so forth. It was sheer political theater as they feigned compassion for the working class, only to provide ideological cover for their assault on affirmative action. So here you have a scholar who has the courage to say this is sheer political theater. It wasn't a debate, sheer political theater. One of the overarching questions in the entire body of Steven's work is that race relations in general are contingent on a number of different factors, and that the burden is on the researcher to prove that there is less or more racism now than there was 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. In other words, racial progress is not a given. Why should race, Steven poses this question in his work, all throughout his work, why should race be any different than any other social phenomenon of human social relations? There's ebbs, there's flows. As he points out tonight, there's 2 steps forward, there's 1 step back. Very equally often, though, there's 1 step forward and 2 steps back. To take just one case study, if one looks at African American citizenship and voting rights, we have a number of different steps forward and steps back. African Americans, many male African Americans in the North, or some, won the right to vote in the North in the wake of the American Revolution, only to lose this right in the 1830s, as state constitutions revised as states revised their constitutions to exclude blacks from voting. A much larger body of African American men win the elective franchise after the Civil War, only to lose their right to vote with the defeat of Reconstruction. And in our own time, after only a few decades after the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, when we thought we had this thing solved, now a full-scale assault against voting rights in the society. Legislatures and governors in certain states, which will go unnamed, began working to make it much harder for African Americans, Latinos, Haitian Americans, and others to vote. While felony disenfranchisement laws in states like Florida pretty much assure right-wing control in Florida for the rest of our lifetimes, unless something changes. Steven Steinberg asks the right questions. The title of his talk this evening is Civil Society, the Perennial Racial Divide. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. This is the right question to ask. Do we have a civil society? You cannot take that thing for granted. Maybe we don't have a civil society. That's why I love the fact that he's problematizing this. He's questioning this. He's always questioning his work. This afternoon, students at the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program enjoyed a vibrant lunchtime conversation with Dr. Steinberg. We had a wonderful discussion about the role that oral history can play in social justice-oriented scholarship. We learned that Dr. Steinberg knows where to go in order to understand how our society works. In his case, one of these places, and I didn't know this until today, was the all-black town of Nicodemus, Kansas. Not many scholars could find Nicodemus, Kansas on a map. But here's a younger Steven Steinberg in the pre-GPS era making the odyssey to Nicodemus and retracing the steps of the legendary exodusters, African Americans fleeing from the South, looking for freedom in Kansas in the disastrous aftermath of Reconstruction. If you want to continue the discussion about pioneering work in the context of the pursuit of truth and social justice, I hope you'll join the Proctor program next Tuesday. This is a PSA, by the way, at Pew Hall at 6 p.m. And we passed around some quarter sheets. We are co-sponsoring an evening panel with Smathers Libraries. Dean Judy's here with us on basically celebrating the acquisition and the coming to UF of the Stetson Kennedy papers. This is a tremendous advancement for us here at UF. Stetson was involved in the kind of social justice research and work that Steven Steinberg has been involved in during his life. My final thought about Steven Steinberg is that he's a tremendous role model for all of us in integrity, in questioning the society that we live in at all times, and in standing for human dignity in all arenas. When I think of Dr. Steinberg's scholarship, I think of that wonderful passage by the immortal James Baldwin in his book, No Name in the Street. Herein, Baldwin is trying to come up with a definition of how justice works in a society. He says, quote, well, if one really wishes to know how justice is administered in a country, one does not question the policemen, the lawyers, the judges, or the protected members of the middle class. One goes to the unprotected, those precisely who need the law's protection the most, and listens to their testimony. Ask any Mexican, any Puerto Rican, any black man, any poor person. Ask the wretched how they fare in the halls of justice, and then you will know not whether or not the country is just, but whether it has any love for justice, or any concept of it. It is certain, in any case, that ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have. And again, I want to thank the Center for Humanities and the Public Sphere for carrying on this tradition of social justice scholarship and for bringing Steven Steinberg to visit with us today. Thank you. Professor Sean Adams.
Thank you, Paul. My name is Sean Adams. I'm from the Department of History, and I'm acting director of UF's Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere. And I'd like to welcome you all here tonight formally and remind you that this is actually the second talk in a series entitled Civil Society on the Future Prospects of Meaningful Dialogue. The flyers are up here, and you can see them around campus. And visit our website, and you can find out more about the series in general and also the specific talks. If you'd like, also we have a sign-up sheet for being on our email list. We send out a weekly agenda every Sunday for events that are upcoming in the UF community. It's my role also to thank our generous co-sponsors tonight. who include the UF Office of Sustainability, the Honors Program, the Department of History, the Department of English. And tonight I'd actually like to offer special thanks to Smathers Libraries, and of course my colleague from the History Department, Paul Ortiz, and the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program for their generous sponsorship of tonight's program. We try our best to make a kind of collaborative space in the UF community for meaningful work in the humanities, and we can't do it without our co-sponsors. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the Associate Director of the Center, Dr. Sophia Augured, as well as our assistant, Sarah Harms, for all their work in making this talk possible, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Office of Shared Services, for providing administrative support. We'd like to ask you all to join the discussion tonight by reserving your questions for the Q&A portion of tonight's session, but if you'd like to join us on Twitter, we ask that you use the hashtag UF Civil Society. That's one word. That's also, the mention of Twitter is also a gentle reminder to turn off all cell phones and silence them at this moment. This is your chance to do that surreptitiously. Okay, so the title of tonight's talk, The Perennial Racial Divide, 2 Steps Forward, 1 Step Back, is very suggestive, I think, of the provocative, complex, and significant issue of race in American society. And of course, here in Florida, we're well aware of the challenges facing us in coming to grips with the wider meaning of race, as our state is often front and center in provoking intense dialogue concerning its place in modern American life. So although we're very troubled at the tragic events such as the Trayvon Martin shooting last year, which thrust Florida into the forefront of arguments about race, our hope at the Center is that our civil society discussions might begin the hard but meaningful conversation about those issues. And we have a speaker tonight who I think is ideally situated to lead that conversation, and I'm pleased to offer this formal introduction. Steven Steinberg, is sociologist, is Distinguished Professor of Urban Studies at Queens College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And beginning with his book, The Ethnic Myth, which actually is in 3 versions, the most recent one being, or 3 versions, the most recent being 2001. His intellectual project has been to challenge those prevailing orthodoxies on race and ethnicity, as my colleague Dr. Ortiz just mentioned. And what's interesting about it is both in academic and popular discourses. His next book, Turning Back, The Retreat from Racial Justice in American Thought and Policy, was the recipient of the Oliver Cromwell Cox Award for Distinguished Anti-Racist Scholarship. And his most recent book, Race Relations, A Critique, which came out in 2007, was actually featured in a Research and Books column of the Chronicle of Higher Education. And one reviewer described it as a devastating expose of a century of the discipline's theoretical bad faith, sociological mystification, and conceptual obfuscation of what should have been the central and obvious socio-historical fact of the white oppression of people of color in the United States. He's recently published articles in scholarly journals such as Ethnic and Racial Studies, Context, Logos, and the Boston Review. And in addition to his academic publications, Dr. Steinberg has published articles in a wide variety of public forums. And so, for those stellar academic and public speaking credentials, I'm very, very honored to introduce our speaker, Dr. Steven Steinberg.
I feel compelled to also acknowledge the very generous and warm reception I've received from colleagues, from Professor Augured especially, who did so much to plan this event and set its agenda, and also to help me and to set my agenda. And my colleagues as well. Am I doing something wrong? Do I start over again? And the wonderful students I met this morning, I was in the basement of Building C, where I encountered art students who are doing the most incredible work in producing really creative products that sort of bridge politics and art and really induce us to use our visual capacities and sensibilities to look at the political world, the world of politics, the troubled world with new and different insight. And then lunch with Professor Ortiz's terrific oral history group, all of whom are doing really interesting and important work. And so it's really been a genuine pleasure to be here and to participate in this really important lecture series. I wish every college had a center of humanities and public issues to share the edifying ethos of the humanities when it comes to examination of urgent public issues. And I also want to acknowledge and thank the courage of the organizers to invite a firebrand like myself, not that I did not script that, but to engage such a thorny issue as race and racism, which too often are relegated to a back burner for fear of stoking controversy. Speaking of which, I realize that I stand here at the epicenter of the Trayvon Martin case. As someone who lives a bare mile from ground zero, I know that proximity matters in the sense that it heightens consciousness and passions. And I've read about the protest rallies in Gainesville by Dream Defenders and by SDS people, echoes of my own student years at Berkeley. Glad to know they're still around. And I just wanted to mention that the reverberations from the Trayvon Martin case reached even my neighborhood in Greenwich Village, New York, where there was a demonstration in Union Square that was dubbed the Million Hoods March. So I could not come here without engaging this thorny issue as well. However, as a scholar of race and racism, I see my role as one of stepping back from the surface reality, including the riveting drama of the courtroom, and putting these events in a larger framework of analysis and in proper historical context. I think this is what the folks who planned this series meant when they asked for a meaningful dialogue, because I think we have to do more than just bring people together and just shout across the ideological divide. And what we really need to do is to examine the history that produces and reproduces the perpetual racial divide, which is the title I chose for this lecture. I invoke the word perpetual on a note of irony, since slaves, as you know, were condemned to slavery in perpetuity, and as recently as 1963, Governor George Wallace proclaimed segregation now, segregation today, and segregation forever, which became the rallying cry for the forces opposed to integration. Well, slavery and Jim Crow have been relegated to the trash heap of history, but we have to ask whether the events surrounding the Trayvon Martin case are testimony to the perpetuity of American racism, even as it morphs into new and different and more insidious or elusive incarnations. We have to ask whether there is still a color line in American society. I heard of one just as I traversed, I forget, Main Street or something, about the geographical and racial segregation that still pervades this community. But I can't say that without owning up to similar realities throughout New York City itself, and certainly the surrounding areas. I met a student today from, where was it? She here? I'm blocking the name of Laurelton, Queens, not far from Queens College, where I teach, which is a middle-class black enclave. Nassau County has the dubious reputation of being the most segregated county in the country. So this is not just a question of singling out or beating up on events that have happened here. Whether there's still a color line in American society, one that Trayvon Martin crossed on that fateful night, despite the fact that the gated community in Sanford is 20% black. Whether the gates themselves beg for analysis. I was just reading a piece in the New York Times that talked about Sanford as being a bounded community, and with that gates symbolizing a kind of bounded state of mind that's shared by the residents there, and that ends up sort of stoking fear and prejudice. Whether the color line perhaps today is more nuanced than it used to be. If I were more of a cultural studies person than I am, I would focus specifically on the hoodie and what that represented in the mind of George Zimmerman and the forces that shaped his consciousness and actions. After all, in New York City, that famed citadel of tolerance in which 81% of New Yorkers voted for Obama, each year, 600,000 young black men and Latino men stopped by police and frisked for no other reason that, like Trayvon Martin, they fit a profile of the criminal, which seems to amount to being young and black, with or without a hoodie. Indeed, the stop and frisk policy in New York was instituted by David Dinkins, the first black mayor, and sanctioned by a succession of mayors, such that there have been more than 4 million stop and frisks since the policy was instituted in 2002. I think I'm saying all of this to read my own subconscious so that I didn't seem like this New Yorker with a kind of superior attitude or smugness coming down here and lecturing you about race and racism. Somewhere later in my text, I was going to mention the fact that, and I'm not saying this just because I stand below the Mason-Dixon line, that I've always thought as a social historian that the South gets too much of the blame for the whole dismal record of slavery and racism generally. After all, slavery was a national institution that was essential to the growth of the national economy. And it produced all of the profits in international trade that went into industrialization. It could not have existed except through a collaboration of this sort of geographical and racial division of labor. I think Karl Marx said it best in a single epigrammatic sentence where he wrote, without slavery, there would be no cotton. Without cotton, there would be no industry. So in a sense, the whole, in the ultimate sense, it's not a matter of hyperbole, even though it sounds like that, to say that the nation, our nation, was built on the backs of black slaves. So if you travel with me down this path, you'll see that in a certain sense, American society was on trial for creating the conditions that put Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman on a collision course. So let's see what we can learn from that tragic event about race as we enter the 21st century, still carrying the baggage of 2 centuries of slavery and a century of Jim Crow. Long time. Now, I'll be arguing here tonight that the so-called civil rights revolution and I'm going to explain why I'm bracketing that with that caveat, so-called civil rights revolution, has spawned a counter-revolution that has grown in strength over the past 50 years. 50 years. This counter-revolution has gone remarkably unnoticed, which in itself is testimony to a blind spot in discourses, even among scholars of race, and even among people otherwise sympathetic to the black cause. Indeed, this counter-revolution is camouflaged by exalting individual figures and watershed events. As we celebrate Martin Luther King's birthday, the election of the first black president, and recently the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. For sure, these are events worth celebrating. However, my point is that this counter-revolution has succeeded to stall, roll back, or nullify most of the gains of the so-called civil rights revolution. This is what I'm getting at by my subtitle, 2 Steps Forward and 1 Step Back. On second thought, 1 step back may have been a bit of an understatement. Glenn Ford, the uncompromising editor of the Black Agenda Report, an online magazine, recently wrote, "We have regressed further than we have overcome." Perhaps that's an overstatement. I'll let you decide. Before we plunge into history, and mindful as I am that this event is sponsored by the Humanities Center, I'd like to begin with a short epigraph from Herman Melville. In his short story, Benito Sereno, a 19th century novella about a slave rebellion, Melville wrote, it's very short, "Shadows present, foreshadowing deeper shadows to come." Shadows present, foreshadowing deeper shadows to come. So as we probe the history of race, I think we confront these deeper shadows that emanate from slavery itself. I mean, for me, at least, in my mind, it's all compressed into one phenomenon. I know to young people the Civil Rights Revolution seems a long time ago, much less Jim Crow, much less slavery. But I think we have to confront, as Melville was telling us, the long shadow of history and the ways in which they foreshadow still other things. So I think that's where history and the humanities can come together, hopefully to illuminate. They often say of young people, and I say this at my peril, that they think history began when they were born. Historians try to counter that as best they can. And sometimes history may seem to be a kind of remote or esoteric sort of discipline. And I might as well lay one card on the table. I've been accused by one notable historian, might as well name him, David Hollinger, you know him, Sean, who accused me of threadbare history, which is to say, I think that's the worst insult you can get from a historian. But my goal here is to look at the big picture, okay, in 45 minutes only, and to try to conflate, try really to document for you with some precision how we evolved from revolution to counter-revolution. In Black Reconstruction, published in 1935, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, quote, the slave went free, stood a moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. Okay, that was the phenomenon that Professor Ortiz alluded to, and it didn't take very many years between the Reconstruction Amendments in the 1860s and the collapse of Reconstruction with the Plessy-Ferguson decision in, 1877. And what we have to do to speed ahead is to ask whether we're experiencing the same kind of nullification or backsliding or negation of the much heralded achievements of the Civil Rights Revolution. Needless to say, it can hardly be denied that the passage of landmark civil rights laws in 1964 and 65 were monumental achievements. They were the high point. And we can take comfort in the fact that blacks are no longer in the back of the bus. However, blacks and whites, blacks are still behind whites, far behind, according to every metric that sociologists have devised as indicators of well-being. Child mortality rates, longevity, housing, food security, access to medical care, and of course, income, jobs, and wealth. All of this adds up to something, and that is that second-class citizenship is not a thing of the past by any fair reckoning of history. The mantra of the recent 50th anniversary of the 1963 March in Washington was, "We've come a long way, but we have a long way to go." But even that statement misses the point which I'm flogging here, that the last half-century has been a period of retrogression, where, to repeat, most of the gains of the civil rights era have been stalled, rolled back, or nullified. To put even that in history, I think we have to begin by asking whether the Civil Rights Revolution was a revolution in name only. In name only. Yes, the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65 were, as I've already said, monumental achievements, but they only restored rights that were supposedly secured by the civil rights laws and Reconstruction. These statutes proscribed discrimination in public accommodations and elevated ex-slaves to full citizenship, including the right to vote. And here we were back in the 1960s, a whole century later, fighting for these same rights. If this is progress, it's progress of a people on a historical treadmill. A second yes, but. Yes, the restoration of African Americans to full citizenship was a watershed event, but not much credit can be given to the institutions of our vaunted democracy. Granted, in 1964, in the historic decision in Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education, the Supreme Court reversed its 1896 decision in Plessy versus Ferguson, which held that state laws mandating racial segregation in public facilities were constitutional, according to the separate but equal doctrine. The ringing declaration in the 1954 decision was that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Some scholars cheerfully regard Brown as testimony of the self-rectifying capacity of democratic institutions, or the vigor of American democracy. Never mind that it took 58 years to rectify this error. Never mind that the 54 ruling was decided on the narrowest and flimsiest of grounds, which left the door open to decades of obstruction and circumvention. Never mind that schools are more segregated now than they were in 1954. At least de jure segregation is a thing of the past. Better late than never, better half a loaf than none at all, but we can hardly celebrate the end of Jim Crow as a vindication of American democracy. Indeed, we might take a lesson from Native Americans who commemorate Columbus Day as a day of shame, since it marked the beginning of the genocide of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Instead of celebrating Martin Luther King's birthday, perhaps it would be better to mourn his assassination, to remind us of the long shadow of slavery that still hovers above American democracy. The third yes, but is that the political momentum that culminated with the passage of landmark civil rights legislation in 64 and 5 did not come from above, which is to say from political or intellectual elites. Rather, it came from grassroots insurgency, from a movement of ordinary people who revolted against racial oppression. Indeed, the state, from Congress to the FBI to the courts and law enforcement agencies, were not allies but were powerful adversaries in the struggle for civil rights. And JFK got aboard dragging his feet. One last yes but. Although the passage of civil rights legislation in 64 and 5 was a watershed event that marked the end of Jim Crow in the South, these laws addressed issues of liberty, not equality. It was not long before civil rights leaders struck a new refrain. What good is it, King asked in 65, to be allowed to eat in a restaurant if you can't afford a hamburger? When Whitney Young advocated programs of compensatory hiring, the proposal was instantly embroiled in controversy, and even liberal supporters of civil rights were vocal in their dissent. Here was an early sign that there would be little popular support for affirmative action when it evolved as policy in the 1970s, much less for the ongoing reparations movement, which doesn't go away and doesn't get anywhere, any real political traction. And as political protests shifted from the South to the North, it became increasingly clear that racism was not just a Southern problem. To my mind, blaming George Zimmerman for racial targeting is rather like blaming the overseer for slavery. I say this in the context of the comment I made before about race and racism and slavery itself being a national institution. For some, for both George Zimmerman and the overseer, they have to bear moral and legal responsibility for their acts of violence. But in the larger picture, they are merely the agents of violence in a long chain of causation that reaches all the way back to slavery. And failing to trace the backward linkages of these wrongs lets the rest of us off the hook. So, counter-revolution, let's think about what that involves, is built on the shards of revolution. The losers, the true believers and beneficiaries of white supremacy, do not fade quietly into the penumbra of history, but they retrench and mobilize to restore their power and privilege. Again, after the Civil War, it took only 28 years from the passage of the 14th Amendment, which established that blacks were equal under the law, to Plessy versus Ferguson, that sanctioned the principle of separate but equal, thus driving the last nail into the coffin of Reconstruction. Recent historians, have dubbed the period beginning with the 54 Brown decision and the passage of civil rights legislation in 64 and 5 as the Second Reconstruction. This began with the dismantling of legal segregation in the South, and it also extended to de jure segregation in the North as well as the South, along with policies and a litany of court decisions to implement and enforce desegregation in schools, housing, and labor markets. The most important initiative, in my view, of the Second Reconstruction was affirmative action, because it was only this that shifted away from issues of liberty to issues of equality. And the whole point and thrust of affirmative action was to drive a wedge in the system of occupational apartheid that existed since slavery. I call it occupational apartheid to underscore the fact that we're not dealing here with just sort of random or even common acts of discrimination by individual whites against individual blacks. We're dealing here with a system that excluded whole groups from whole sectors of the economy for all of American history. I mean, that's a very big deal, okay? whole groups from entire industries through all of American history. And so that wasn't going to be remedied easily by just passing a law, and it really required a more activist and legally sanctioned program to integrate blacks, because that's what we're talking about, integrating blacks into the workplace. An early study I did was of the sort of question, I sort of asked a naive question, why after the abolition of slavery, why didn't more blacks do what my grandparents did, which was to leave disadvantage and oppression in Europe and gravitate to the sort of expanding labor markets in the North as industrialization took off. And the reason for that was, and the naive question was, because the answer should be obvious, that there was pervasive racism in those labor markets themselves, in the northern labor markets, and didn't provide any real opening or access for ex-blacks. So we're only 4 million refugees from slavery, and they could easily have been incorporated into these sort of expanding labor markets in the North. And had that been done, we would not be here discussing certainly the perpetual racial divide. So whose fault is that? That's really points the finger of blame at northern industrialists, and not just them, but their unions that were rapidly racist and white supremacist in their own way, in that they considered industry in the Industrial Revolution as something that existed for whites only. So that's another big deal. When the Industrial Revolution was for whites only, as though a placard was out front that reserved the job, those jobs, even though most of those people who were hired were immigrants, but immigrants from Europe. And even though we hear much about the barriers and the bigotry and class that immigrants from Europe encountered, they, in the final analysis, as is clear in retrospect, shared a kind of common whiteness, which they weren't exactly received as racial brothers or that kind of thing, but the fact is that they were not black. Okay, so here we're dealing basically with a black, not black kind of distinction, which also, I think, applies in important ways to the differences between current immigrants, who are mostly people of color from Asia or Latin America, and also have their own battles, their own grievances, their own barriers of discrimination to overcome. But whatever the obstacles, whatever their burdens, they still not white, but not black either. Okay, so the story of the unraveling of the Second Reconstruction is and this is my thesis here, is a chilling parallel to that of the First Reconstruction. And once again, the Supreme Court, reflecting a backlash in the society at large, acted to overturn laws and policies enacted by all three branches of government. No sooner did Nixon launch the Philadelphia Plan in 1969, whose objective was to integrate lily white construction trades in Philadelphia and other cities, then the Supreme Court, packed with three Nixon appointees, I'm going to say more about this in a few minutes, issued the first of a series of rulings that led to the eventual gutting of affirmative action, where we are today. There's a really interesting side story of this, because Nixon is really the unsung hero of affirmative action. No one wants to take credit for that, but he and his Assistant Secretary of Labor, Arthur Fletcher, who is something of a black capitalist, convinced his boss George, not Romney. No, that was his HUD guy, and the guy who became Secretary of State. Okay. Convinced, I'm sorry? Hey, this is being preserved for, speaking of posterity and perpetuity, my stumbles are going to be also part of the forever record. Okay, we'll think about that. But he convinced them, and he thought he was attacking democratic labor unions in cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago, and there was no political loss in doing so. But as soon as there was pushback from that, and it triggered a larger backlash, he kind of switched sides and opposed the very quotas that he had himself put into place. In the case of the voting rights, it took longer to reverse the '65 Voting Rights Act, which marked the triumphant climax of the legislative phase of the civil rights movement. But here we are 47 years later, just the day before yesterday, figuratively speaking, in the 2013 Shelby case, the court annulled the enforcement mechanism that secured the vote for African Americans. And within days, the states of Florida and North Carolina, only within days, they were poised to act, enacted laws that rely on Jim Crow subterfuges, which are neutral on their face but discriminatory in practice, which is to say that there's nothing patently discriminatory about requiring a photo ID, but the whole understanding the intention and the effect of doing so is to discriminate against blacks and Latinos and poor people generally, and young people as well, who are less likely to, unless they're endowed, blessed with passports or the right driver's license, if that's accepted, which is not always the case. Okay, so this leaves us again with the question of whether history is repeating itself with the Second Reconstruction, and whether it's destined to end as the First Reconstruction did, which is to say in calamitous ruin. I've just given you the general contours of my argument about the shift from revolution to counter-revolution, but with your patience, I'd like to flesh it out a little bit and to be a little less threadbare. So that's where I want to go. In retrospect, the seeds of counter-revolution were planted even before the passage of the 64 and 65 Civil Rights Law. And they really came to fruition just at the point we're talking about in the 68 election, which Nixon won by a landslide. Now, this was sort of amazing because only 4 years earlier, Lyndon Johnson had won in a historic landslide over Barry Goldwater, which set the stage for Johnson's Great Society and his war on poverty, which were largely driven by racial politics. Goldwater's defeat was so devastating that pundits at the time declared that conservatism is dead. So much for pundits, right? With their short, with their sort of myopic view of the world. So what happened between Johnson's election landslide in '64 and Nixon's landslide in '68? Well, the single most important event was the passage of '64 and '65 Civil Rights Acts. Indeed, as Johnson signed the '65 Voting Rights Act, he's reported to have said, "We've lost the South for a generation," which turned out, of course, to have been a large understatement. Beginning with Nixon and extending to George Bush, Republicans controlled the White House in 28 of the next 40 years, which resulted in a Republican majority in the Supreme Court that was nurtured by the Federalist Society. That was an association of conservatives. This was a conservative effort which deserves some grudging approval for the way they organized from the bottom up and developed a whole network of associations inside law schools all over the country whose whole mission was to counter the liberal activism of the Warren Court with an evolving conservative activism. And of course, the Republican control of the White House gave them the opportunity to see their fruits, their efforts bear fruit. The result has been the Burger, Rehnquist, and now Roberts courts, 44 years and counting of Republican control of the Supreme Court. In effect, this has amounted to a tug-of-war of liberal activism and conservative activism, and the conservatives have proved triumphant, which has meant, once again, not to flog this refrain too much, moving back toward slavery. Du Bois's comment was, the syntax was interesting. His point was not that blacks moved back to slavery. Slavery was a thing of the past, but they moved back toward slavery. Okay? The major factor in this political transformation was the political realignment that Johnson predicted. The South bolted from the Democratic Party, beginning and end to the unholy alliance between Southern conservatives, dubbed Dixiecrats, and Northern liberals. In the 1968 election, Humphrey won only 10%. This was a Democratic candidate who usually garnered most of the Southern vote. He got 10% of the white Southern vote. The 5 states that comprised the Deep South voted for George Wallace, and those 5 states voted for Goldwater in 1964. So in a way, the counter-revolution, the seeds were really planted before 68. Or you could go back to Strom Thurmond in 48 as seeing an early sort of sign, a precursor of what happened. So it was slow to developing, and I submit to you that this is what now is defining this entrenched warfare between blue and red states. Okay, the 5 states, the rest of the South and border states voted for Nixon. So let's be clear about this. I mean, in the prosaic language of social science, political science, they say, well, there was a realignment of politics after passage of the Civil Rights Law. But to not to disappoint Professor Ortiz and to say it as it is, Negroes were granted elementary civil rights of citizenship, which is all they got in 64 and 65. And in the next election, the entire South seceded from the Democratic Party. So this was really the source of this division between, if you look at the electoral map back then and now, this division between red and blue states with a diminishing number of swing states. In 1972, which was kind of the last hurrah of the left and liberalism in general, we put up most left-leaning candidate of all, George McGovern, and he got clobbered in a historical landslide, which has never been forgotten. And now pundits were declaring that liberalism was dead, which can be argued either way. They had reason to think so, and I think you can read into this history the sources of the racial and ideological vitriol that's aimed at Barack Obama after his unlikely ascension to the White House. Liberals were all right, I don't want to even say that. Okay, racial backlash was not the only factor. Really, there was a kind of wedding of the racial doctrines and really doctrines of white supremacy in the South with the evolving conservatism where they found a home in the more conservative wing of the Republican Party. So I think we're really here sort of beginning to sort of explore the roots of the Tea Party and the possible, maybe likely breakup of the Republican Party as moderates may defect if they're pushed too far. What was even more ominous than the revolt of the Dixiecrats to the Republican Party was that Wallace's strength. Wallace had unexpected traction with white voters in the urban north, which triggered a white flight. Now we're talking about white flight not from integrated neighborhoods or integrated schools, but we're talking about a white flight from the Democratic Party. And as Bruce Schulman writes in his book on the 70s, quote, in Rust Belt cities, Wallace's advocacy of law and order, you knew who he meant. There were all these code words now, whether it was law and order or welfare or schools or morality or sexualities and so on, was all code for race. And their contempt for anti-war protesters in opposition to further civil rights advances won Wallace the admiration of many working-class white ethnics. The early 60s vision of peaceful, non-violent reform of ending poverty and racism evaporated. One word sort of signifies the deep and abiding political loss that we've yet to recover from. The handwriting was on the wall. The Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, would reemerge as the party of segregation. Nixon wasted no time in rewarding his new electoral base. He nominated 2 outright segregationists to the Supreme Court, and both of those nominations were beat back by Democrats in the Senate. So he lost that, but he put up other more acceptable, respectable conservatives. But this, for sure, was an unmistakable sign that a counter-revolution was in full swing. Okay, the same can be said of Reagan when he announced his candidacy for president. Where did he go? He went where you guys have gone, to Mississippi, to Philadelphia, Mississippi. Again, symbolically signaling the counter-revolution. The Confederacy rises again. So in retrospect, I think, because here you have, what sense can you make that on the one hand Nixon is backing the Philadelphia Plan, and on the other hand he's nominating segregationists to the Supreme Court? What's going on? And I think the answer is that he found himself in the interstices between the shift from revolution to counter-revolution. I think this explains why his policies oscillated from left to right, from right to left, and back to right again. On the one hand, his Southern strategy to capture the South from the Democratic Party succeeded. But the nation was still reeling from the spiral of riots from in the aftermath of the Martin Luther King assassination and mounting opposition to the Vietnam War. Nixon, the same Nixon, appointed George Romney, that's the other George, yes, Mitt's liberal father, as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and he got into office, and with some vigor and determination, he launched a policy to integrate the suburbs, okay? The suburbs, a place where whites fled the central cities, okay, to get away from the black nemesis. And so when the predictable backlash erupted, Nixon reneged and eased Romney out of office. So integrated housing and another nail in the coffin of this civil rights movement, along with the integrated schools that are implied or possible from integrated housing. George Shultz, okay. The thing is, when Nixon first proposed this, he was confronted with a revolt among Democrats in Congress, okay? And a lot of this revolt occurred because labor always opposed any kind of regulation of labor markets. Equal Opportunity Commission going back to the Depression years, because they wanted to preserve their monopoly, a white monopoly on jobs in the whole industrial sphere of the economy. He also encountered opposition from some, not all, prominent Jewish organizations for reasons that I'm going to go into in just a minute. There was sort of paranoia, and even civil rights organizations who didn't trust Nixon didn't jump on the bandwagon to support the Philadelphia Plan because they couldn't believe that it could possibly be well-intended. I mean, maybe it was done with political cynicism, but it still offered a very major new initiative that could have rewritten history. What happened was that George Mitchell, another unlikely, unsung hero of affirmative action, beat off the challenge to the court, Supreme Court, which deferred to the ruling of the appellate court. And at that point, affirmative action in the form of goals and timetables, you remember that language, and it's of affirmative action mandates measured by goals. What's a goal? Is it different from a quota? That became the big issue, and a timetable for coming into this was all goals and time of all government contractors. In other words, they were using the leverage that the government had as issuing contracts to private corporations as a way of regulating and requiring that they show good faith efforts and results in terms of integrating their workforce. Again, it was in a way a conservative principle, because instead of the kind of make-work efforts that Democrats always come up with, they said, well, look, we have this magnificent edifice. It's called capitalism. It's called the national economy of 100 million workers. And all we have to do is fold this small minority into the ranks of labor. And problem solved. But this came up under heated opposition from labor and Jewish organizations and others. So now it was affirmative action that engendered a firestorm of opposition, and once again Nixon flip-flopped. According to historian Nancy McLean, within less than a year of its proclamation, around 1971, we're talking about word spread that the Philadelphia Plan was to die a quiet death. In the 72 election, Nixon ran against the very quotas that he put into effect, and in 73 he appointed Peter Brennan, the New York City building trades leader who organized the hard hat demonstrations in relationship to the Vietnam War, as Secretary of Labor. Pound, pound, two more nails in the coffin of the civil rights movement. Now, something else happened in the universe of politics and ideology. Concurrent with the Civil War in politics was a civil war in the realm of ideas. According to McLean, the emerging political discourse against affirmative action did much to resurrect the conservative cause from the doldrums of the Goldwater defeat in '64 and the right's inability to find any traction among the public, that is, except for diehard Republicans. They weren't, there was, I mean, it's sort of amazing now when you see, consider their deep influence and traction. By the early 70s, conservative quotas realized that they could, conservative operators realized they could reap political hay from white resentment over quotas. William Buckley, the founding editor of National Review, discovered commonality with the new ideological pathways forged by a new political formation of neoconservatives at Commentary magazine, which had been a prominent liberal publication of the American Jewish Committee. The neocons, so-called, consisted of former liberals who had become disenchanted with liberalism with respect to both domestic and foreign policy. Seasoned activists that they were, as early as 1964, these nascent neocons at Commentary saw the handwriting on the wall that any talk of compensatory programs or proportionate representation was antithetical to Jewish interests. As a small minority numerically overrepresented in elite colleges and professions, they recoiled at the prospect of quotas. Never mind that these were quotas designed to include an oppressed minority, not to exclude an overrepresented minority. Nevertheless, the whole idea of quotas was anathema, and memory for them of the numerous clauses, which was a designation for quotas in Russia, in colleges and professions, figured prominently in the Jewish imaginary. So according to McLean, Buckley observed the work of neoconservatives with mounting admiration and excitement. Affirmative action provided conservatives with an issue that went beyond fighting communism and championing free enterprise. At the same time, it dispelled suspicions that conservatives harbored a latent anti-Semitism or animus toward blacks or Jews. So with this ideological facelift, conservatives could now present themselves not as the enemy of equality, but as a champion of colorblindness. Instead of opposition to blacks and civil rights, they rallied to the defense of white males against what they called the new equality, which according to Robert Nisbet, a conservative writer, was the gravest single threat to liberty and social initiative. You have to see this in the context of the politics of the 1980s, which was centered on a crusade against quotas, against affirmative action. Now, again, Professor Ortiz, I mean, is not that they felt any passion to protect workers from the disadvantage that they might experience. And it wasn't the thing itself, it just symbolized something in terms of the loss of white privilege that they could appeal to rally support for their conservative politics and political agenda. So thus, with the help of the neocons, conservatives used the controversy over affirmative action to turn the tables on liberals and to develop an ideological blueprint for the restoration of conservatives to power. I don't have too much more to go. By the 1980s, opposition to affirmative action had grown into a veritable crusade, waged by right-wing pundits and publications with the indispensable funding of right-wing foundations and think tanks. As in the case of the Civil Rights Revolution, the partisans of counter-revolution, as in the case of the Civil Rights Revolution that the partisans of counter-revolution sought to negate, the shifting political currents reached into the university and the ranks of social science. We're not innocent of all of this. Charles Murray's 1984 book, Losing Ground, argued that the welfare state created the conditions that it purported to remedy: welfare dependency, non-work, family breakdown, rising crime, moral breakdown. Thomas Sowell, Ben Lowry, and a cadre of black conservatives, lavishly funded by foundations and ensconced in leading universities, put a black imprimatur on this victim-blaming discourse, thus putting to rest all allegations that white sociologists like Daniel Patrick Moynihan were racist when they made similar claims about the defects of the black family and black culture that, according to them, were the source of the black plight. So getting back to electoral politics, both Nixon and Reagan appointed 3 conservative jurors to the Supreme Court. Thus, the rise of conservatism, which in many ways was itself propelled by racial backlash, led to a series of Supreme Court rulings that steadily eviscerated affirmative action. By 1995, the cover page of Newsweek proclaimed that affirmative action is dead. Whatever your reservations about affirmative action, and I know it could be reasonably debated on both sides, it can hardly be denied that its gutting will not lead to the colorblind society that some of its critics envision, but is, again, another step back towards slavery. In my view, the recent Fisher decision only postpones the final coup de grace in that it stops short of a total rejection of the use of diversity as a factor in college administration admissions. I don't think it's well understood even by black leaders how calamitous the gutting of affirmative action is. The prevailing reasoning subscribed to by Chief Justice Roberts is that affirmative action has, his words, outlived its relevance. After all, having blacks made enormous strides in the professions and corporate management, not to speak of the White House, doesn't the prominence of blacks among celebrities, especially in popular culture and sports, suggest that racism is no longer the mad bumblebee that it once was, to use Shelby Seal's clever phrase? Didn't Justice O'Connor cast a reluctant vote in the 2003 Grother decision, opining that affirmative action was a temporary remedy that would be unnecessary in another 25 years? The problem with these arguments is that they have causation in reverse. Most of the gains of the post-civil rights era are directly the product of affirmative action, which pried doors open in colleges and occupations that have been closed since slavery. Remember here what I said before, we're talking about not discrete acts of discrimination motivated by racial bias, but rather a categorical exclusion of whole groups excluded from entire occupations for all of American history. So affirmative action was a policy that was designed to address structural racism, and to a large extent it's achieved its purpose. But to invoke Justice Ginsburg's reasoning in the recent Shelby case about the Voting Rights Act, throwing out affirmative action when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory behavior is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. Indeed, affirmative action has worked, and the gutting of affirmative action has already led to an erosion of black representation in colleges and employment, which is to say, again, the last time, I think, it signifies a movement back toward slavery. To my ears, the argument that affirmative action has outlived its relevance has a familiar ring. In 1975, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, making it a criminal offense to deny accommodations in an inn, public conveyance, theater, or other place of public amusement on the basis of race or color, exactly what was in the '64 Civil Rights Act. But only 8 years later, the Supreme Court held that the law was unconstitutional. In his majority opinion, Justice Bradley reasoned as follows. I wish I could imitate his erudite voice. When a man has emerged from slavery and by the aid of beneficent legislation has shaken off the inseparable concomitants of that state, there must be some stage in the progress of his elevation when he takes the rank of a mere citizen and ceases to be a special favorite of the law, and when his rights as a citizen or a man are to be protected in the ordinary modes in which other men's rights are protected. What Justice Bradley called a special favorite of the law in 1883 is what Justice Scalia called a racial entitlement, alluding to the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Once again, we see the startling similarities in the discourses of the first and second Reconstructions as the forces of counter-revolution proceed in both cases. And again, in both cases, hijacked by the nation's highest court and used to rewrite the law of the land, which they did with revanchist fervor. Not only has affirmative action been gathered, but in two recent decisions in the Supreme Court, in 5-4 majorities, they narrowed the scope of Title VI of the '63 Civil Rights Act, prescribing employment and discrimination. The decisions make it harder for workers to prove that they've suffered harassment by a supervisor or been retaliated against because they complained of discrimination. Once again, settled law is cast aside by a revanchist Supreme Court. Another nail, I thought I counted them all, in the coffin of the Civil Rights Revolution had an et tu brute quality as Bill Clinton affixed his signature to the 1996 so-called Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act, which effectively governed AFDC. Aid for Dependent Children, which existed primarily for children and usually the mother of those children, among the poorest people in the nation, provided a meager stipend for housing and a living allowance based on entitlements that had been in place since the Depression. Even though 2/3 of the recipients were white, welfare was tagged as a black thing. In his 1976 run for the presidency, Reagan had a field day lampooning the woman on the south side of Chicago who had 80 names, 30 addresses, 12 social security cards, and is collecting veterans' benefits from 4 non-existing deceased husbands. Quite a riff. It turns out to be totally untrue. And was collecting welfare and food stamps and bragging a tax-free income of okay. The whole point of all of this, including his derisive politics, is that it helped to racialize welfare, despite the fact, to repeat, that most welfare recipients were white, and convince aggrieved whites, so pump them up with a sense of racial grievance so that they end up voting against their own interests. So concerned that anyone who's not a, quote, real American might derive some benefit that they even end up sort of shooting themselves in the collective foot. Just as Obama has been tagged by his critics as stealth reparations to blacks, even though, once again, obviously most beneficiaries will be white. Also interesting is to note that AFDC was never all that costly. Between 1970 and 1993, total federal and state spending on AFDC benefits increased from $15.5 billion to $22.2 billion, adjusted for inflation, a pittance in relationship to the federal budget or all kinds of other expenditures, much less the hundreds of billions of dollars of bailout for banks. Even though the number of recipients increased by 91%, costs increased by only 44%. It's not like costs were running out of control because average monthly benefits per family had shrunk almost by half. So again, why was this a big deal? Why did they single it out? Because there was really cynical political hate to be reaped from doing so, not because it was ever that big an issue, but again, it's sort of played upon and stoke the resentments of whites about their own declining wages and welfare. So it sort of shifted all of the blame in their minds to the racial others. So the final blow came in 1996 when Bill Clinton, casting himself as a new Democrat, affixed his signature to the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act, annulling those things. So another nail, and the next one I'll just cite in moving to a conclusion, was the Crime Act, okay? Again, one wonders why Clinton is so loved by, well, and forgiven by liberals or loved by black folks, because in the case of the 94 Crime Act, which also was passed in a context of surging reaction in the polity as a whole, it established a three-strike law that mandated life in prison for third serious drug convictions under federal law. The act also eliminated Pell Grants for prison inmates. It refused to address racial justice issues, including disparate sentencing and appeals for inmates on death row. Not that Obama has done much either to address black grievance, lest he be seen as giving preference to black communities, despite the fact that blacks were particularly hurt by the foreclosure crisis and that the black rate of unemployment is twice that of whites. Instead, like Clinton, Obama has taken refuge behind the adage that a rising tide raises all boats. But does it really? Which is the thing about race, isn't it? It would be closer to say that treating unequals the same is a sure way to produce and reproduce existing inequalities. Well, I think the most grievous setback has to be the Voting Rights Act. This was the high point of both the first and second Reconstructions, was to secure the vote for African Americans. And here we are in 2013, again celebrating the first black president and celebrating the anniversary of the Civil Rights thing and the March on Washington and the National King holiday and so on, witnessing deliberate attempts to suppress the black vote. According to the NYU's Brennan Center, the voter ID laws, which have been passed in 34 states, will disfranchise as many as 6 million voters, mostly black and Latino. Add to this another 6 million impacted by felon disenfranchisement. Florida, since I'm here, I'll this time take the hit for this. Florida leads the nation with over 1.5 million disfranchised voters, constituting 10% of the voting age population. Some states even bar people with misdemeanors from voting while they're in incarceration. So, stepping back and thinking again of the first and second Reconstruction and whether the second one is destined to end badly for us. To quote Robert Wesley, law professor at Tulane, quote, "Every measure passed by Congress during Reconstruction, the first Reconstruction, for social and political equality of blacks, with the possible exception of the 13th Amendment, was subverted or made null and void before the turn of the next century." So my hope point, to repeat, is that we're pretty much doing the same thing as we witness most of the hard-won gains of the Civil Rights Revolution being stalled, rolled back, or nullified altogether. Some years ago, an author in The Nation, whom I've forgotten, wrote the history of warfare would be entirely different if we assume the point of view of the victims rather than the perpetrators. That really talked to me. Let us, even for a moment, assume the standpoint and the subjectivity of the new generation of African Americans who grow up in poverty, exactly the underclass that George Zimmerman and his neighbors in the retreat at Twin Lakes fear. Their first transgression is to be born black and poor. Already the promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is circumscribed at best. They are systematically denied access to jobs that pay a living wage, which is the catalyst behind the so-called cycle of poverty. They're routinely targeted by police for even walking in their own neighborhoods. If they surrender to temptation and try to make some fast money selling drugs, they're sent to prison for unconscionable years. when we could decriminalize drugs in the first place. And then let's look at the bigger picture, the role of public policies that exacerbate rather than alleviate their plight. With time limits on welfare, I'm just recapitulating the points I made, families are thrown into hunger and homelessness. 200,000 units of public housing across the nation have been blown up on the basis of a bogus theory of deconcentrated poverty. With gentrification of cities, they're increasingly displaced from neighborhoods, and their public hospitals and social service agencies are shut down. The schools also are shut down under the Obama-Duncan policy cynically called race to the top. Blacks are thrown into competition with immigrants, even for low-wage jobs. Not that these immigrants don't have their own struggles. And affirmative action, which for a while seemed to open the door of opportunity, has been effectively gutted. Even with the first black president and the first black attorney general, there's no serious enforcement of laws against discrimination in housing and employment. Our backs are against the wall. Disfranchisement is back. Convict labor is back. Even legal lynching is back. What else was the Trayvon Martin case, if not Emmett Till all over again, an official license and cover-up for killing a young black man who crossed the color line? Okay. That's my brief. So the mega theme here has to do with the counter-revolution on race. This is not something new. It's not something ephemeral. It's been going on for half a century. It's really entrenched in American politics and ideology. Audiences, I've noticed, even authors of books, of academic books, which erudite works, seem to crave for a happy ending, some silver lining, some straw to grab onto, encouraging a happy resolution going forward. But then again, we have to remember it took 58 years from the first to second revolution, and I think we have to acknowledge that this has been a period of a catastrophic setback to not just to the black liberation movement, but to American democracy that has yet to shake off the yoke of its original sin, which was to sanction slavery in the founding document, the Constitution, that was predicated on the Declaration of Human Rights, and as we fought for our freedom from the yoke of oppression, we committed ourselves, a nation, to 2 centuries, all told, of slavery. And then when that failed, okay, and was it really a revolution to begin with? Okay, all it did really was to confer rights to an obsolete system of Jim Crow. That had become obsolete. It developed as a period after slavery of forcing blacks into work. It substituted a system of sharecropping for slavery. It was a system of debt servitude, the peonage, that still produced that indispensable product, cotton, that found its way that supported the regional economy of the South, and found its way into the coffers of wealthy traders and corporation industrialists in the North. So I don't know. I guess I'm going to end on a total note of dismal pessimism. Young people especially like to be optimistic, but maybe if you want to, we can sort of address the question of what next. Is it as bad as I portrayed? Is it even worse, as Glenn Ford suggested when he said we've lost more than we've overcome. And is it possible to see some glimmer of hope from someone younger than myself? Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you. Sure, of course.
Dr. Steinberg has agreed to some questions, so I'll go ahead and moderate. Yes, ma'am.
I would like to address the question of what can we do to actively change it?
Well, we need a new movement, I guess. Okay, I mean, if you're asking on, I think, speaking as a person in the business of ideas, that the first thing we have to do is confront the sad and discouraging truth. Okay, and maybe that will prime us and motivate us to get involved in some way. But even the civil rights movement, so-called, it's hard to discern the movement. Even all the talk about black African-American leaders, it's hard to discern who they are. You have a tremendous influx of immigrants that, in a way, bypass the issue of race, and who's never been good for blacks, but worse than that is that people point to their advances, their success as a way of, again, pointing the finger at blacks. What's wrong with them? Others come here and succeed. And I don't know. Does someone else want to present a more hopeful case? I think step one is to let all of this sink in if you're convinced by this critique. And I'm not going from the podium to sort of spin out some hopeful scenarios, but just to get involved in anti-racist groups or other kinds of political formations. And it's hard, and Professor Ortiz referred to a piece I wrote about the left's default on race, because they've also have larger fish to fry in other agendas. And it's very difficult for the left to rely upon labor and the whole romance of labor to provide some foot soldiers for their movement. And they see race and affirmative action itself as very divisive among the constituencies of the left. And you saw what happened with labor and Jews and others. So it's hard to know. Okay, here's my answer, okay? I actually encountered this in my next to last previous book, okay? And I asked the same question. Well, how am I going to get out of the book? Where do we go from here? Which was the question that Martin Luther King himself asked in his last book before he died, published in 1965. And I think his answer then isn't too relevant now. But I turned up a quote from a Lerone Bennett, who's an intellectual and writer for Ebony magazine from its inception. And he said this. He said, every decade of the 20th century has seen some attempt, some movement to advance the cause of liberty for blacks. Each one of them has failed. But in each instance, the next, I'm paraphrasing, the next movement began at a higher stage of development. Okay? So it's not as though we're beginning, it's not as though the challenges are the same. There was a lot to accomplish through the civil rights protest movement and the legislation, those advances. Affirmative action was once the law of the land that was approved, that got the imprimatur of the Supreme Court, and so on. If you want to be hopeful about something, if Obama gets one more appointment, I think there's a law professor possibly in the audience. I'd like to ask her. Would he appoint another judge in Sotomayor's ilk who would approve it? So will 4-5 become a 5-4 majority? My shorthand answer is don't count on it. Because, again, the climate outside, there's no support for it in the American electorate as a whole, even among liberals, even among the left, okay? So I think we have to wait for some probably unforeseen, unknowable event or something to catalyze, to trigger this movement at a higher stage of development. That's very ambiguous, but does that give you some hope? Sophia.
Quickly, you mentioned that academia and higher education can sometimes be the problem and not the solution. Are there things that you think that we teach that we really that are part of the problem, or things that you think we teach that might be glimmers of the solution?
Aside from my books, you mean. I think I alluded to the phrase "a civil war in ideas." I mean, I think the civil war in politics, and I think we're still fighting the civil war. It's not clear if the North ever won the Civil War. Lorraine Hansberry was so puzzled on that very point. Because it wasn't really done to change power, to change resources, to have some program of restitution for 2 centuries of slavery and a century of Jim Crow, okay? In each instance, it fell far short of anything that can accurately be called revolutionary. There's been what I call a scholarship of backlash in the academy that's been sort of run astride the backlash in the society as a whole with a kind of resurrection of victim-blaming ideologies that we thought we had answered at some point, and then keep coming back again in new guise, a new form. You know, the new ideas of the culture of poverty. Okay, first it was relative deprivation, and then it was the culture of poverty, and then it was the underclass discourse, and now they're talking about social capital, which is lacking in the black community, and values, without asking anything about where those values come from. So yeah, it's going to be an uphill flight. Even in the academy that presents itself and is, to a point, sort of sympathetic to the whole issue of equality and racial justice. But they're kind of sort of countervailing sort of tendencies, and they don't come from anywhere, because the one in the secret of our academic enterprises, all this research runs on money. You and I have talked about this a bit, which means government and foundation grants and so on, and who and what gets funded and so on. So it's going to take something, I don't know what, to sort of jolt us out of the rut we're in today. Yes, sir.
Sort of following your talk, the counter-revolution as it unraveled the being of, the civil rights movement, it has progressively again disempowered, the black community, and they've lost a lot of the rights that they've gained. So, in a certain sense, you're saying that if they've been progressively disempowered, how do they mount a response in institutional terms to counter the kind of institutional response that came from the conservative movement? And ultimately, my question to you is, it seems to me that the response, if it has to be institutional, has to come from white people in the liberal camp. And so how do you convince white people? And from what it seems to me, what you were saying is, for a lot of white people in the liberal camp, what's going on doesn't necessarily pose a major threat to them, what's happening with the black community. So how do you convince them, other than broad ideas of equality and liberty for all, that fighting for the black community is in your interests?
There was the appearance that we made huge progress, and the development of the first sizable black middle class outside of the ghetto economy was seen and applauded as progress, okay? But again, I don't think that happened because of any deracination of labor markets. It happened because you had that heavy-handed government that's so ardently opposed by Republicans from the Tea Party all the way up into the top, into major segments of the Democratic Party as well. So I think you're asking another version of the same question. I should have come here, and I'll send an email to my sponsors. I don't have a kind of rosy scenario. Maybe we have to confront the fact when we've been licked and tried. I'm sure there are others. I mean, the urban revolts of the 70s got people's attention, right? The Civil Rights Movement got Johnson's War on Poverty. The revolts were really what got affirmative action, which began a whole decade after the 65 civil rights. Okay, they were trying to quell the unrest among the natives in major cities and so on, and that created some motivation and leverage for liberal politicians, or even, well, you saw it was Nixon and his, ironically enough, who pushed the idea. And in terms of beginning where other protests left off, I mean, we do have that important precedent, okay? And we're one tantalizing vote away in the Supreme Court, except that the political, as I said, sort of context doesn't support it. So.
One more question.
I just want to piggyback on the comment that was just made about what can be done. It seems to me part of the race project has to be whites taking on at a micro level, dealing with other whites about their racism. Blacks can speak with authenticity about what it's like to be a member of an oppressed group in the history, but whites speak with authority to other whites about that history. And it just seems to me, I mean, all of this, the background information that white allies have has to be taken back to their families. So instead of saying, my family's racist, now I live someplace else and I have my own community of friends, the work has to be, it seems to me, going back and dealing with the family members, going back and confronting incidents in the classroom or in the faculty dining room, that the work is as much a project.
Well, maybe it's my concept of politics, but and I understand good people doing good things and talking and so on, but I think we have to think about how we're going to move the powerful institutions of our society who have the resources and the power to make a difference in a really big way. But I think your comment has provided me with my swan song here, since I think I really need one, that if I understand it, your series was prompted by having 3 speakers who were supposed to be provocative to raise issues for discussion. That's part of your agenda going forward. Okay, so I'm going to go back home to my little incubator in Greenwich Village, and I hope, I say this sincerely, at least provoke some thought to reassess the situation to see how critical it is, and that'd be a wonderful thing to run some workshops and brainstorm about what we can do. And if Steinberg's right that yes, but this doesn't go far enough, or he's right that it's impractical in the present time, in the other times it took really black insurgency in the South from the bottom up that threw America into a crisis, and a constitutional crisis, right? It didn't just happen because people sat around their coffee rooms or churches and connected with other people. So I think we need a theory of social movements and a theory of social change. Okay.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have.
Thank you.